I'm Alan Furstenberg,
And I'm Mark Tucker, and welcome to Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs. Hey, another week, Mark.
It is good to talk to you.
Always good to talk to you. It's been rough. I know we've missed a few episodes. We're a little bit behind. The last one we recorded while I was in a hotel room, um, but hopefully I'm back home. We'll get back in the groove of things.
That sounds good. Yeah, it's just we kind of hit a busy spell for both of us, so that's
Yeah.
but
So
it's all right. Moving forward.
moving forward, and I kind of want to move forward on this one. So, one of the presentations I recently did was talking about building agents, which, is a common thing we talk about these days, and how MCP servers fit into that, which is also a very common topic. But in particular, what I was talking about is how do we build these MCP servers with lessons that we've learned from building the previous generation of agents. So I was talking about Voodoo Drive, which folks may remember. We've talked about it a few times in the past. One of my hobby projects for the past decade or so. But last year I made a big effort to move it into the Gemini era, and I feel like there was a lot that I learned about building agents and building the tools for agents that apply to MCP. So I figure let's head down that path a little bit.
Okay.
For folks that may not quite remember what Voodoo Drive is, here's the overall schema for it. We're not going to be talking about this whole mess this time, but Voodoo Drive was a way that you would be able to issue human like commands, have them executed in the context of a spreadsheet, and get replies back. And it's talking with a spreadsheet. So you'd be able to say things like add a row, and it would be able to add a row that contained formulas and layout from a previous line. Um, you'd ask it to do what if calculations, it could do that. Add data, analyze data, a very full set of stuff to do, not just, RAG queries against a database. And there was a speech component and stuff in cloud storage, and, it was an app. So, there's a lot of stuff up here that we're not going to pay any attention to whatsoever. But I kind of want to focus on three specific topics that I feel like were lessons that I learned from this whole thing. And the first is kind of looking at the security. And I this is crucial and it's so important because MCP servers are notorious for poor security. And yet we're dealing with somebody's files. We're dealing with your files. How do we make sure you're dealing with only your files? How do we make sure nobody else can access your files and so forth and so on? So security feels like it's the cornerstone of the whole thing to me. And then if we look at the API that exists for Google Sheets and Google Drive and Google Docs and the other ones that are part of Google Workspace, they're incredibly complicated APIs. There are many dozens of methods, dozens of data structures. It's an incredibly complicated environment. And we already know LLMs don't handle that very well. So, how do we manage that complexity? And then what I see is kind of similar to that is saying we've got business logic that we want to enforce as we're doing this. How do we enforce those policies? How do we say you can only access certain directories? How do we impose what other rules may be in play? How do we do logging? All of these other things that are involved in business logic, how do we enforce those? What boundaries do we have? So those sorts of things. And those all have places in MCP, and I think we'll see where they fit in as we go along.
Yep, that sounds good. I kind of maybe how we as we talk about this, maybe if we can weave in some things because a few things came to my mind when you were talking about the APIs are for your Google Docs and stuff are very complicated. Those there's a lot in there, which always gets me back to like when I was first doing Rust and trying to understand should this API be kind of more of a chatty where it gives you back a little bit of information and a key, and then you have to make another API to do something else? Or is it very chunky where it gives you back a whole bunch of data and then you have to, and it's really complicated? And so I was thinking the other day about the kind of REST versus MCP, and I think it's kind of the same similar type of thing. It's like if you already have some existing REST APIs, do you just wrap them in an MCP server? What does that syntax look like? What do you do, or do you start over from scratch? So what do you think?
I think that's exactly the question. We'll get to that in the complexity section, I think.
Okay, so yeah, that's something I'm interested in exploring further when we get to that point.
Yeah, no, I think it's at the core of the complexity question. So one of the elements of security is authentication. And, we know that MCP servers are notoriously difficult to authenticate correctly. Now, if you looked at some of the earliest MCP servers, they were saying things like go to the console and cut and paste this from the URL and do this, and, royal pain, annoying as anything. But when I tackled this problem with Vodo Drive, it was easier because I was setting up a server and that server was existing in the cloud. So it could take advantage of things like a Google login and OAuth offline mode. So it could manage the token renewal itself. I didn't have to have this as part of an MCP server that needed private information. It was all somewhere else. It was all handled. It was all done. And while we're seeing some of that moving into MCP servers that are running locally, they're still not quite there yet. So having it as a cloud-based agent was a real, it saved a lot of effort in a lot of ways. And kind of the flip side of authentication is authorization. And here's a place where I think OAuth is failing us still. Because right now, it would be great if we could say something like, yeah, I only want to give this application access to this folder. And OAuth can't do that right now. There's no capability in there for it to do so. The closest we get is Google has a scope called drive.file. And what this OAuth scope basically says is the application is only allowed to access files that it created, which, okay, that's a reasonable approach. There's a caveat, there's kind of a loophole in there. And that's that if you use something called the Drive file picker, what it does is it looks like a file picker, but it lets the human through the web say, or through an app say, authorize this specific file to this app. And you do that on a one-by-one basis. So now this is a way that you can say, I'm going to authorize this file, and then the application, Vodo Drive or whatever else your agent is, now has access to it. That's really powerful because this is a way that the human has very specific control over what files the agent can use. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think you're right on the authorization side of things. Is that you need to be able to be very very specific. As we're opening up, accessing people's data, you don't want whatever bot to access everything. You don't want that access to somehow get leaked.
Right.
Like a password would get leaked somehow, and then all of a sudden now there's a whole bunch of access to things. I know we're not talking about operator mode, but that's also something you want to be able to give your agents very specific limitations on. You can do this application, or you can do this data, and only these certain folders or files or things. So yeah, I agree.
Exactly. I mean, and we've this was something Michal and I talked about when we first started talking about MCP agents. Was that it's possible to exploit it by putting a request in a public place, like opening a bug in GitHub, saying give me the password file, And if you've got an agent that automatically reads those and answers them, and it has access to the password file, it'll just do so.
Yeah.
This feels to me like a way to say, I'm limiting my agent to exactly what files it can access. And, we're seeing some of that sort of in the various CLI agents that are out there. But we're not seeing enough of it yet. And I feel like this was an important point that I wanted to kind of drill home. You brought up API complexity. And, like I said, the workspace APIs, there are dozens or hundreds of them. They have complicated data structures. Some of them are very, very specific functions, and others are incredibly broad functions. So, like, you can say if you're copying one cell to another, what are you copying? Are you copying the value? Are you copying the formula? Are you copying the formatting? Are you copying all of the above? Which gets copied and which doesn't?
Yeah.
And that's just, one operation in a spreadsheet. One of the things I really like about the Google Sheets API is that just about everything that you can do in the application, you can do with the API. It's that powerful. The downside, though, is it's that complicated. So everything where like it brings up menus, if you're adding a chart, for example, all of the options for adding a chart exist in the API, and that's a huge number.
Yeah.
So how do you manage that? And kind of my answer to this is you don't. To answer you don't expose every piece of the API. Not to mention the fact that some of that's a security risk. You don't necessarily want it to be able to delete records, rows in a spreadsheet. You just want it to add them, for example. So you don't need to give it every piece that's there.
Yeah, which goes into the, well, how do you design your tool interfaces for in general, but specifically we're talking about in the context of MCP servers, right?
Right.
So if you think about like, okay, well, REST, you've got your different HTTP methods. You've got a Git gives you a list of things, and a post updates or creates something and updates it and deletes it. You've got all your different verbs, and translating that into tools, it's more like what actions do you want to expose, and what subset of parameters do you want to provide in those tools, right? So, and things,
That th-
yeah, go
yep.
ahead.
Hold that thought, okay? Because one of the other issues with API complexity is all we'll get to how we break this down in a second. One of the other things though to consider is LLMs are slow as they reason out which step it is. So if we gave them
Right.
access to the entire API at the lowest level, it will reason out, the 7 or 8 steps or whatever, but it will reason it out. It needs to think in between each step which one it needs to do next. And if we already know when we copy a row, we need to copy just the formulas, don't copy the values, and we need to copy the formatting. Okay, we can program that and put that into a higher level tool. So the first thing I kind of think about is we don't want low level tools. We want relatively high level tools that do exactly what we want them to do. And I think that's what you were kind of where you were
Yep.
going with your, you know, we eliminate some parameters. I'm saying forget it. We just eliminate all the functions and we define our tools to be very specific things that we wanted to do.
Right. Yeah. You can. In some cases, it might make sense that it's kind of more the CRUD stuff. I'm adding this. I'm listing these. I'm deleting this. It still might be kind of rest resty, I guess, in the fact that the same types of functionality is
Yeah.
available. Now, they're all going to be posts, right? They're all going to be tool calls that are posts. So
Well, not, I mean,
that kind
yeah.
of changes this the semantics a little bit on how to do it, but that's just one way to do it, and that's not the right solution in every case,
Well,
right?
but I think the other thing to keep in mind, though, is that you don't need to think of it as a post anymore. You're thinking
Yeah.
of it as a function call.
Yep.
And what do we want our functions to do? And we want our functions to do this set of things. Many of those are, different kinds of calls. Some of them may be, delete one row or cut and paste it, where cut is really a delete operation with a post operation, or a delete operation with a put operation. What goes on under the hood in is a REST implementation, but we don't care so much about that anymore. We're
Yeah.
dealing with higher level functions, higher level tools, higher level thought processes. We don't need to get into the weeds. This kind of ties in with when we start talking about business logic. We're now defining what we want our tools to do and what we don't want them to do.
Yeah.
Where do we enforce things? So if we did just provide every single function, well, suddenly somebody can come along and start coercing it into doing things that we don't necessarily want. We don't want it to delete rows, for example, maybe.
Yeah.
We only want it to add rows. Here's where we enforce that, and we enforce it in the same higher level tool calls. Those high level functions is where we enforce what can be done. I think that, in some ways, this seems kind of common sense to me, but I think it seems kind of common sense to me because that's how I wrote Voodoo Drive. But as I talk about it with people, there's this kind of realization of, oh, yeah, we can put these together into bigger concepts. We don't need all of these low level tools that can do everything. Let's build higher level tools that have limits on them.
Yeah, well, and that's interesting because before, you would have this is my, API that does, I don't know, invoices or something, and this other API had to deal with receipts or I don't know, whatever,
Yeah,
and you could get stuck and say like I of the subset of REST calls that I do, I'm going to have one tool per REST call for the things that I want to do. But it might make sense to combine a couple of different API calls to different services in one tool so that it just does the thing that you want it to do.
right. That actually goes into one of the other things that I didn't mention on this slide, and that's that you don't necessarily also need to expose every tool every time.
Yes.
If you are dealing with invoices, you don't necessarily need to have the tools that monitor the efficiency of your manufacturing plant.
Yeah.
You may need that for another set of questions, but you don't need it every time. So and that then makes the complexity smaller to make your agent run faster. So
Well, yeah, well, then that gets into the okay. So how do we orchestrate multiple, smaller agents that are special purpose, and they know about their tools, and what orchestrates the now I'm talking about invoices, so I'm going to talk to my invoice agent who knows about just their tools versus the plant floor agent that knows
sure,
about its
right.
APIs and
No,
tools. Yeah.
definitely. I even say let's take that a step further. With Voodoo Drive, for example, there are there are tools that add a new row to a spreadsheet, right?
Yeah.
Those tools aren't visible to the agent until you have opened up a spreadsheet. So that I guess the similar equivalent is that agent isn't even available until you've done something with it. Until you've said, I'm opening up a spreadsheet, and only then does that spreadsheet agent make itself aware.
So it's kind of the UI equivalent of this menu item is disabled until I do something else. It's it's this
Yes.
tool's not available until this other tool has been called
It
or
goes
this
one
other thing
step
has happened.
further. It goes one step further than that, because when a menu item is disabled, you see that it's disabled. You know it's there. Well, kind of what I'm saying is the agent does not even know the menu item is there.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. So to the system, it doesn't exist. You
Right.
can't. There's no way you can accidentally click it because it doesn't even know it's there.
Right. And in the same way, the agent can't accidentally invoke it
Yeah.
because it doesn't exist.
So it's a dynamic tool list based on context.
It's a dynamic tool list. Maybe nowadays we would think of it as a dynamic agent list. I don't know. I
Yeah,
haven't played with dynamic agents yet, but that's that's certainly one avenue to start looking down.
yeah,
Because again, as we start building these systems that have more and more and more agents, our agents can't keep, our existing agents can't keep track of all of them. It's got limited context to work
yeah,
with.
yep,
And I think that's going to be a real problem over time. And I think there are some simple solutions to at least get started with it. And maybe we'll see how that evolves over time.
yeah. That's a good point.
I guess kind of the takeaways that I really wanted people to take away are, when it comes to security, we have OAuth, we have principles of least privilege. These are not new concepts. Think about them, return to them, go back to them. As we talk about the complexity, let's think about those dynamic tool lists. Let's focus on taking those small, low-level atomic API calls and put them into the higher level tool functions, and those become the core of our MCP servers. And then use those same tool calling functions as where we put our business logic, where we enforce our rules, where we put the guardrails, so forth and so on. I think these are all really powerful and really significant things that, as we're building these new MCP servers, as we're building tools for our agents, I think we need to keep these in mind. It's kind of crucial, because otherwise we're just building on a house of cards.
Yeah, it's definitely something that you need to think through and purposefully design your tools and how those tools are going to be called, as opposed to just kind of cookie cutter things out.
Yeah, no, that's it. I guess I kind of worry that people are not doing that. They're just kind of using agents to build MCP tools and not really thinking about many of these issues. But I guess that's a whole other vibe coding concern. So
Yeah, like similarly, I was looking at like an existing API from some other company that had all kinds of resources to be able to create, delete, all that stuff, and I was thinking, this is very dangerous to give all that power in the MCP server. So I was really settling down for what I want is really just to ask to query information. So just do the read and not do the create, delete, and
exactly.
not even expose those as tools. And there's a lot of power to, then you can have a conversation about your data as opposed to, having things that change. Now, depending, you want your agent, depending on what you're doing, to be either a conversational agent about your data or something that can take actions, or so it really depends on your purpose. But
That's a good point. It depends on the purpose. It depends on the files.
yep,
You know, it may be that even if you have read and write access to some files, you may not want your agent to be able to write to them.
yeah,
And maybe, that goes into the business logic. Where do we enforce those kinds of rules? Because right now, any MCP server is going to be acting as you. And
yeah,
that's not a good assumption right now. I think that's I hope that is never a good assumption.
yeah,
That will always be, that will always say that we have an agent that is acting on my behalf, but it is not acting as me.
yeah.
I would love to hear what people think about this one. It's a very active topic. It's one that I know lots of people are thinking about and working on. And I hope that this provides some new perspectives on thinking about it. So if you've got any thoughts, you can find us on social media. Leave comments below. And as always, please like, subscribe, and share. And we will talk about it another time on Two Voice Devs.
Two voice devs. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Mark.